Okey, selamat petang semua, salam sejahtera, Assalamualaikum, salam bulan Ramadan untuk semua. Terima kasih kerana meluangkan masa bersama Pusat Sejarah Rakyat sekali lagi bulan ini. Bulan ini memang agak sibuk ya kerana kembali ke pejabat, bulan puasa untuk pelajar sekarang tengah pertengahan semester. Jadi semua memang saya tahu agak sibuk dan keletihan sedikit. Jadi kami memang ucapkan ribuan terima kasih kerana meluangkan masa. Diharap webinar hari ini akan memberi semangat dan inspirasi untuk semua. Saya yakin perbincangan kita ini memang menarik hari ini. Bersama hari ini adalah pembentang Qaleeda Talib dari Imagine Malaysia. Dan ia akan diikuti oleh komentar oleh Wik Kok Hin. Dan moderator untuk hari ini adalah Azura Nasron. Webinar ini kita akan buat dua bahasa, bahasa Inggeris dan bahasa Malaysia. Jadi dipersilakan untuk memberi soalan atau memberi komen dalam kedua-dua bahasa juga. Di sini sebelum saya membuka ruang kepada para pembentang hari ini, saya ingin beri sedikit introduction kepada moderator kita, iaitu Azura Nasran. Azura is a graduate of political science who is currently pursuing a master's degree at the University of Malaya in the field of Southeast Asian Studies. She's also currently working with Swaram, focusing on the repeal of draconian laws. She is the chair of Gerakan Pembebasan Akademik, a student organization championing academic freedom. She's a founding member of Record Media and also a member and contributing writer of Journal Sang Pemula. All three platforms focus on bringing forth ideas based on social justice. So Azura is actually the perfect person today to host and moderate our conversation about student activism. So the title of today's presentation by Qaleeda Talib is Student Activism, Reclaiming the Narratives. So with that, can I pass the baton over to Azura?
Okay, boleh dengar dia semua? Pertama sekali saya nak ucapkan terima kasih kepada Pusat Sejarah Rakyat kerana mengadakan webinar ini. Saya fikir webinar ini sangat bertepatan pada waktunya, terutamanya apabila hampir 2 minggu yang lepas kita dikejutkan dengan suara-suara mahasiswa yang tiba-tiba muncul, ya, suara-suara mahasiswa yang sudah lama senyap dalam pelbagai perubahan politik, masalah sosial, masalah ekonomi, tapi suara-suara mahasiswa ini senyap. Kecuali pada 2 minggu lepas apabila berlakunya satira politik logo UKM oleh Fahmi Reza, mahasiswa-mahasiswa ini tiba-tiba keluar. Suara mereka keluar pergi balai polis, pergi report, ya, tulis artikel panjang. Jadi saya fikir, oh, ada suara mahasiswa ni rupanya. Ya, cuma sekarang ni selepas seminggu ataupun 2 minggu, suara ni kembali hilang. Ya, dan saya fikir pada pembentangan hari ini, saya berharap pembentangan kita boleh menjawab adakah hilangnya suara ini adalah sesuatu yang aneh ataupun yang memang kita jangkakan, ataupun memang mahasiswa kita sudah berubah arah tuju, ya. Dan ini akan dijawab melalui pembentangan Qaleeda sebentar lagi apabila beliau menceritakan penyelidikan beliau dalam student activism, di mana beliau akan menceritakan reclaiming the narratives. Dan saya percaya narratives dulu mungkin berbeza dengan sekarang. Kita tidak tahu, kita tengok dulu jawapannya macam mana nanti. Okay. Seperti dikatakan oleh Dr. Rusesina tadi, saya Azura Nasron, monitor pada hari ini. Dan presenter kita pada malam ini, yang pertama adalah Qaleeda Talib. Qaleeda Talib adalah Vice President daripada Imagine Malaysia, an NGO that advocates for better historical literacy, the exploration of alternative Malaysia histories and locating Malaysian history within a regional Southeast Asia context. She graduated with a BA in history from Oxford, for which she produced a dissertation on the ideology of the Zubayrids and their role in shaping early Islamic identity in the 7th century. While she lists governance and history of religion as her academic interest, Qaleeda's long-term goal goes beyond academia. She aims to advocate for more sustainable policies and frameworks for humanities education, including creating space for humanities research and institutionalizing Malaysian museums as centers of education and research. Maafkan saya Qaleeda, saya baca bio pun susah. Saya percaya perjuangan Qaleeda ni lagi susah ya. Terutama je untuk institutionalizekan Malaysian museums. Ya, saya tak sabar sebenarnya untuk tunggu waktu ni. Ya. Dan pembentangan ini akan berjalan selama 30 minit. Di mana selepas itu akan ada komentar daripada saudara Ooi Kok Hin. Ooi Kok Hin was a Mobukako Gusho scholar at Waseda University. Saya harap saya sebut dengan betul ya, Kok Hin. And is currently an associate researcher at a local think tank. His master's thesis explored the roles of student activists and opposition parties in contesting student debt policies and neoliberal discourse in Malaysia. Komentar oleh Ooi Kok Hin akan berlangsung selama 10 minit. Di mana selepas itu kita akan membuka selama 40 minit untuk pada participants memberi soalan. Saya fikir 40 minit ni sebenarnya waktu yang paling banyak sewaktu perbincangan ini, maka kita akan gunakan waktu perbincangan ini untuk membincang lebih lanjut isu ini sebab perkara-perkara ini saya fikir kalau bulan Ramadan ni kita sebut spread the khair, spread the goodness, sebarkan kebaikan, sebarkan wacana keilmuan, maka dalam sesi perbincangan nanti kita akan bedah fakta-fakta yang akan dikeluarkan oleh Qaleeda Talib sendiri. Ya, silakan Qaleeda.
Okay, thank you very much, Azura. I hope everyone can hear me. If tak dengar, just drop me a message and we'll see what to do. Okay, I will be speaking primarily in English. My presentation will be primarily in English as well. Okay, just to start off, I wanted to talk a little bit about what Imagine Malaysia does, because this relates to the project that we did on student activism. So, I mean, you heard my rather convoluted bio. I mean, it looked good in writing, but upon hearing it, it sounds a bit convoluted. But essentially what I'm interested in is basically creating more accessible historical literacy, because right now history is seen as firstly a very academic discipline. It's quite obscure to the layman. And secondly, there's this perception that history is about narratives. It's about choosing the correct narrative. But I kind of wanted to challenge that and say that history is about competing narratives. So this brings me nicely to the project that we've been doing, which is on a history of student activism. So just give me 1 second to share my screen. Okay, so I hope everyone can see it. Again, if you can't see it, Lynn, I'm gonna rely on you to just ping me on this side and let me know. Okay, so the project that we did is called a history of student activism. And why we called it a history of student activism is because we didn't want to create a definitive history of student activism. We wanted to give out the clear message that this is only one way of doing, a historical piece of work. And this is one way of interpreting the evidence. But it doesn't mean that, this should dictate your understanding of student activism. So essentially the research project is meant to be that kind of resource for students to, see what kind of analysis has been conducted and where they themselves can take it from there. Okay. So essentially the project was also a kind of experiment for Imagine Malaysia to create a platform for independent research. So I mentioned just now that the history discipline is seen as very academic, but you would have to enter a university to do research, and you have to be under supervision of an established academic, etc. But we wanted to kind of experiment, is it possible to create this platform to create solid independent historical research? And we wanted to create opportunities for history or humanities students to do historical research outside of academia, and of course be paid like a decent wage for it. There's always this impression that, you know, if you're in academia or you're doing academic work, you have to be content with very low wages. So we kind of wanted to test, can we be disruptive in that sense? Okay. So the second goal of the project is to produce an accessible, collated, and targeted body of work on student activism. So after this, I will walk you through the website that we created, you know, which kind of carries the body of our research and other articles that we produce, our interviews, etc. And you'll see that it's really framed as, you know, a this is a resource that you can tap into, and you don't have to be of a certain qualification to use this work. Of course, admittedly, it's now in English, so that creates a kind of language barrier. But we also acknowledge that, you know, this is not the end of the project. There's always opportunities to kind of take it further, whether it's refining the research or just producing translations of the work. Okay, and the third thing we wanted to do with this project is take a more collaborative approach towards studying student empowerment. As I'll talk a little bit more on later, the work on student activism can be quite siloed. You know, there are many different groups looking specifically at researching student activism or advocating for reforms. But one of the challenges we face is that we're not really speaking to each other. So I wanted to experiment with, okay, what kind of collaborative approaches can we take? Of course, you know, we can do workshops, we can do focus group discussions, but where does it go afterwards? Okay, because it's easy to do discussions, and, you know, people are very willing to talk as well and, you know, share their insights. But how do we then turn those conversations into something more or impactful? Okay. So the project lasted from July to December. I mean, we really started, wait, hang on, was it July? No, it was August. August to December last year. And we launched our website like maybe 2 weeks ago. And essentially there were two parts to it. There was the academic content where the team created a literature review. They conducted focus group discussions and kind of picked out key points from it. They conducted interviews, and they also conducted a survey to kind of kickstart these discussions. So I will show you, you know, some of the infographics that we came up with on the surveys. But, you know, I have to admit that those surveys are not meant, again, to be definitive on the trends in student activism or youth voices. They're meant to trigger a conversation. Okay. And from that academic information, we came up with what are essentially social media content. I realize social media content is, it kind of diminishes the work a little bit, because it wasn't just for Instagram or Facebook, because as you'll see on the website, you know, we had a little bit more, but essentially what we did was, you know, all these things that we produce, we shared snippets of them on our social media channels. Okay, so we created like a kind of timeline of student activism, you know, just walking our audiences through the different points of student movements in Malaysia, you know, trying to kind of group them together and say, okay, this is what defines this period, etc. We came up with some infographics based on the survey. We shared audio snapshots from our interviews, and on our website, you can actually find full interviews. And we had other things like, you know, announcements and calls to action. And finally, of course, all these are shared on the microsite. So what I will do now is just exit the screen and then share the website. Just okay. So this is, of course, the front page, and immediately position ourselves as, you know, a resource of historical materials on student activism. And, you know, one of our key contents is talking about the myths of student activism. So immediately this website, you know, has a kind of resource used to engage with the public, because ultimately, you know, students in activism, they still carry a stigma with them. So these are shareable resources that can be used to, you know, to just read up quickly on what the myths are and what the facts are, and, you know, to make this shareable. And like I mentioned just now, we had content on the timeline. And we also interviewed like quite a range of people. We interviewed politicians who are former activists. We interviewed active student activists. We interviewed the founders of, the co-founders of Undi 18, and we talked to some academics as well. Right, so you can see here, like, these are the different components of our research, but I'll go into that later. Okay, so I'm just clicking on the background. Okay, right. So these are all the shareable resources that I mentioned just now. That's a kind of brief introduction as to what is the landscape of student activism in Malaysia. We have, a small article on AUKU, of course. I mean, you cannot talk about student activism without referring to AUKU. And again, there's the article on the myths. And in terms of the research materials, okay, so basically there were 5 parts to our research materials. The first part is, kind of an introduction. And this is essentially a narrative of the timeline and what evolved, etc. What are the factors that changed the trajectories of student activism in Malaysia? What were the levers of change? The second one is a timeline, which is an elaboration of that. The third one is, just kind of goes into the theoretical frameworks that we use, the methodology, and there's a bit of, well, it's not a bit, it's quite a lot on the data analytics, because we conducted a survey, so we wanted to show like, okay, this is our process. And finally, we would have, we have a document on the findings, summary, and recommendations. Now, the recommendations here are essentially policy recommendations for different parties. So there was one for the government, I mean, not one policy recommendation, but, one portion for the government, one portion for higher education institutions, and one portion for student groups themselves. But I don't want to overstate the importance of these recommendations, because again, we're not here to be definitive, but we're here to kind of create a starting point for people, because as I mentioned just now, the work on student activism can be quite scattered. Okay, and the last most important section is the interview section. So this is where I think it gets really interesting, because one thing we wanted to do is just gather a variety of views on the experience of being a student activist. And that's why we spoke to past student activists, and we spoke to current student activists, and we also tried to talk to academics as well. And if you look at how we, the position that we use to identify some of these individuals, like for example, Sim Zazin is a current politician, but we emphasize that we emphasize his student activist experience, because one thing we're trying to show is that these are the diverse experiences, and these are the type of professions that student activists then go on to occupy, and in what way does student activism influence their perspectives. And we've tried not to kind of draw conclusions from these perspectives, because again, the idea is to have this material here for people to listen and draw their own conclusions, for them to go through that process themselves and hear it from different people, to compare and contrast these voices, and make whatever inferences or hypotheses that they want. Okay, right. So like, okay, we spoke to Datuk Sri Ahmad Syabari Chik, and we, there was a debate on like which of his titles should we credit him as, because obviously he's occupied like several ministerial roles, etc. And we agreed that everyone should be identified based on their student activist role, to show where and how they have evolved. Okay, and inclusive of these interviews are transcripts. So of course, there are audio problems, people can read the interviews themselves. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to my presentation. Oops. Right, okay, just give me 1 second. Right, Okay, so I wanted to keep this presentation very short. So some of the findings that I will emphasize from the project are first, the factors that have influenced the student activist space in Malaysia. And afterwards, I kind of talk about the challenges. So again, I cannot stress enough that this talk is not about, identifying key moments in student activism in Malaysia, because I'm sure, most of us would know already. And secondly, um, this project is not about listing, making a bullet list, a bullet point list of things that have happened. It's about, how can we interpret these events? So one of the things that I think the biggest change in student activism in Malaysia is that from the 1930s to the 1960s, 70s, you have this really vibrant space where students make very bold movements and make very bold choices. They storm universities and they demonstrate, they agitate against not just their institutions but against colonial powers, right? But of course, in the 70s, with the introduction of AUKU, that changes. And what's significant about AUKU is that it's part of a series of initiatives that actually ties activism to future defining consequences. So what I mean is that the state kind of institutionalizes that when you commit certain acts, it comes with consequences that greatly defines your future. So AUKU is one aspect of it. But if we think about scholarship students, for example, I mean, for the longest time, and I think even now, there's always that clause if you're a JPA scholar, if you're a scholar sponsored by the government, um, if you get involved in any demonstrations or any agitations, or you kind of build up a reputation or whatever, you do risk losing your scholarship. Okay, so as I said, this kind of creates a culture where getting involved in these activities comes at a cost. And what's dangerous about this space is that it can be quite unpredictable, because sometimes you can fall under the radar if you're doing certain forms of activism. I mean, if you're like an environmental activist, perhaps you wouldn't be as visible or controversial as a student who's kind of advocating for more political issues. Okay, but that's the thing, if you generate enough attention, then you can easily get called out, or lose your spot in your university, lose your scholarship, etc. So that's another aspect that's quite that makes activism even more costly, the fact that it's quite unpredictable on when you would have to face these consequences. And in relation to that, and basically continuing from that, from those series of movements that makes activism very consequential, um, we begin to create this mindset that activism is disruptive, disrespectful, and undesirable. I think the key word here is disrespectful, because um, there is this sense that in our culture that whatever you do, it has to be done in a kind of polite, respectful way. And in that sense, being disruptive is to be seen as disrespectful, and that makes something like activism very, very undesirable. There is this impression that activism means agitating and calling out against your elders, etc., and you're making things difficult for people, because when there's backlash from the state or from your institution, other students are affected. So there's this myth that activism is, you know, it, it brings more trouble than it does bring good, and it's also disrespectful. Okay. One interesting factor in the trajectory and the evolution of the student activist space in Malaysia is that um, once you have all these kind of shackles in place, other outlets come up for student organization. So, I mean, one surprising thing for me, I mean, this might be common knowledge to some of the people, the members of the audience, but one outlet that allowed students to kind of organize themselves is religion, because instead of kind of having this overtly political agenda, or a role that an agenda that questions an institution, student groups begin to kind of say, well, as an Islamic country, this is how we should be organizing ourselves. These are the ideals that we should aspire to. And of course, it kind of escapes the radar for a while because, it's kind of in line with state values. It's peaceful, so it's not seen as disrespectful. But the concept, the reason I outlined this as, kind of an important factor is that it does create a more divisive role in, it plays a more divisive role in shaping the student activist space. So what I mean by that is there's this impression that, sorry, not impression, that creates this kind of divide between certain groups. So on the one hand, you get a sense of, okay, students are starting to advocate for certain values again, but they're doing it in their own religious cultural clusters. Okay. And of course, this was in the 80s. So, that would be the time when NEP really comes into effect, etc. Okay. Another big influence is, of course, globalization. I mean, in any setting, in any time setting, the moment you have a significant intellectual class going overseas and being exposed to different ideas, a lot of them come back and bring back those ideas that prove kind of disruptive for the local scene. So this kind of ties in with the point about the internet and digital advocacy. So I guess up until, I would say, the early 2000s, globalization as influencing the activist space is still kind of, it's not particularly disruptive yet. But the moment you get in the internet and you have a lot of young people going onto spaces like Tumblr, or at that time probably it was Friendster, you get exposed more easily to different ideas. And of course, around like 2010, Tumblr was, on the rise. And for a very long time, before like Twitter or Facebook became very significant, Tumblr was a space for a lot of different range of ideas. So you would get, kind of nondescript ideas that, Malaysians would be used to, but you also get extremely radical ideas, about social justice. In fact, I remember like, before the term social justice warrior kind of came to Twitter and became mainstream, it was commonly bandied around in Tumblr, and it wasn't such a stigmatized term. It was, a term that a group of people identified with. So the internet kind of, really opened, I don't want to say Pandora's box, because I don't want to stigmatize these ideas unnecessarily, but it did open a kind of box where you get really, really commonplace ideas and then really radical ideas. Okay. And of course, the moment people start moving to Twitter, start moving to Facebook, it just makes these ideas mainstream. And of course, the young people who are exposed to Tumblr then grow up, but they carry these ideas forward with them. Okay. So another disruptive factor, I would say, is of course digital advocacy. And in the context of Malaysia, this is where Undi 18 really came in and made a difference. I always use Undi 18 as a kind of benchmark or milestone in the space of student activism, because one thing they really did is, firstly, they created a new cause for student activism. So on the one, earlier we used to focus, even now, of course, we focus on AUKU, but it was primarily that, about making legislative reforms that directly affect student organizations. But what Undi 18 does is create a new cause where this time we empower students not for the sake of empowerment, but we empower students because they now have, the right to vote. So they have to have political education, and they have to be aware of the processes that goes into advocacy, that goes into the legislative process. So what Undi 18 has now done is actually created a body of, not a body, but they have created specific campaigns that look at different parts of nation building, to use a very crude term. So you have They have a volunteer group that looks at, local elections, local councils. They have groups that look at environment. They have groups that looks at energy, and they have groups that look at education, or Sabah and Sarawak centric groups. And all these are very, very organized, and they also provide that training, to these young people. How do you actually get a campaign started, and how do you sustain it? So I guess prior to the appearance of Undi 18, which is really a result of internet and the rise of digitalization, it's still, I would say student activism is still, it doesn't have that professional sophistication. But Undi 18 kind of leverages on all these different factors, and it creates very organized campaigns. Okay, I mean, these are not students who are just kind of like, okay, let's take to the streets. They actually have like a strategy. Okay, this is our long-term strategy, this is our midterm strategy, and our short-term strategy, and this is how we divide ourselves in groups. This group looks at that issue, this group looks at that issue, etc. Okay, and this ties in with, I would say, the last and most recent influential factor, which is the appearance of, well, not the appearance, but the increasing involvement of young professionals in activist spaces. So their impact, I would say, comes in two ways. The first one is that they help to destigmatize activism, because they create this impression that you can be a successful careerist and still have a kind of a social a social impetus to change things, and you take the skills that you build in your corporate workspace, and you translate that back to your activist organization. So that's the first one, kind of destigmatized. And the second one is basically what I mentioned as well, the transfer of skills. So Undi 18 being able to kind of teach their volunteers, their cohort, to think in a strategic way, to create very convincing corporate-looking decks. It comes from their interactions with these young professionals as well. So it creates this impression that, okay, now activism is kind of firming up. It's become more professionalized, it's become more sustainable, and it's not just based on demonstrations, but it is based also on very tidy, organized project management. Okay, so some of the challenges faced by student activist groups in Malaysia, and I would say that it could be activist groups generally. So the first one, as we know, is no matter how much you want to advocate for certain reforms, ultimately we are still dependent on the moods and appetite of decision makers. So, the calls to reform AUKU has been around for so long, but it wasn't until the Pakatan Harapan government came into power that specifically at trying to reform AUKU. The second challenge is something which I mentioned earlier in the talk, which is that there are so many groups working on common goals, and they involve students, but we're not always aware of what the other group is doing. So if you were to just do a quick Google of student activist groups in Malaysia, you're gonna get like a lot of names like Malaysian Youth and Democratic Association or something like that, and then you have something like Malaysian Youth for Education Reform, etc. Okay, and there's also the kind of moral conundrum of collaborations, because obviously these groups sit across a wide political spectrum, and sometimes you're faced with the question of, okay, we seem to be working towards student empowerment, but we, in terms of the political party that we align with or that we're sympathetic to, there's a kind of split there. So just to share, one of the focus group discussions that Imagine Malaysia had was with a bunch of youth groups that were aligned to MCA, to BN, to UMNO, etc. Okay, and one of our stakeholders was very unhappy with us. So this is a stakeholder that we spoke to earlier, because they felt that these MCA aligned groups do not represent student activists, because they are aligned with groups that they're aligned with a political party that has stifled student empowerment. So they thought that we kind of betrayed our values, etc. So I'm not naming names because I don't want to antagonize them. They did brought up a really good dilemma when it comes to collaborations. Where do we draw a line? How do we draw a line between accountability and the potential for growth, or to change each other's minds, or to find common goals, etc. So there are no straight answers to that. And when we spoke to that stakeholder who criticized us, we were very honest that for the purpose of the research, we spoke to that, and it was something that was required by our funder as well. But we're not going to discount your views and say that it's wrong. It's definitely something that we need to consider in our postmortem. And if we have a similar project, we need to revisit that question of who do we talk to honor our values, but at the same time open that space for collaboration and academic work. Okay, the third challenge is, as we know, and I don't have to go deeply into it, I think, is even though there are more and more young people getting involved in activist spaces, there is still that stigma. I mean, even now, one of the talking points against Undi 18 is that, young people are not mature enough to be involved in this kind of space. They shouldn't have a decision-making power. They shouldn't have a voice in the advocacy spaces. Yeah, I think that that doesn't need any elaboration. What I will say is that it does, actually strengthen the case for change, that, okay, if they're so immature, then we should create more programs to get young people politically literate, to increase their political awareness and have them be competent at making decisions. Okay. The fourth challenge is accessibility. So one of the questions I always ask myself when it comes to these projects or initiatives done by student groups is, who are we really speaking to? There's always that so what question at the back of my mind, and it's not an easy question to answer, because on the one hand you kind of want to to gain supporters amongst the people, amongst the rakyat, and a diverse group of people, but at the same time, if we're talking about advocacy, we also need to have the skill to be able to speak to policymakers and to work with researchers. So the question of accessibility, I guess, is also a question of how do you build a winning team of diverse skills? And is it really about having like all these people in one team, or is it about having groups speaking to each other and kind of building a coalition? Okay. And I guess the last challenge is balancing action with organizational management. So I kept talking about how the appearance, the increasing involvement of young professionals in these spaces, creates this transfer of skill. But one of the debates that happens in activist groups is, are we, professionalizing the activist space? Are we turning, the role of activists into a career? And how do we balance that with impactful action? Because it's not easy to get things done. It's not easy to even come up with a policy paper and to go from group to group, get them to endorse or give their insights, and then you go to politicians or you go to human rights groups, whatever. It does require a degree of project planning and project management. But how do you not get lost in the nitty-gritty of project management and still come up with something extremely impactful? Okay, so again, there are no straight answers, and I think these questions are probably going to be a consistent theme in the decades to come. Okay, So for the last section of my talk, I think we are on time. Not quite, but never mind. I just wanted to highlight some of the work that other student groups have been doing. So again, this is not a comprehensive list. This is not a definitive list. I just wanted to platform, some of the groups that came to my attention recently. Right. So firstly is a newly launched group. It's called Haksiswa. And what they want to do is basically provide legal services for students who are, under duress, for doing activism related work. And they do it for a very small fee, if I'm not mistaken. But they're providing this very niche legal service. Okay. They did actually conduct a focus group discussion recently, I believe, and they came up with a kind of statement signed by their partners, urging the current government to implement the Undi 18 bill. Okay. And the other group that I wanted to highlight is called the Higher Education Malaysia Association. I don't know how familiar you guys are with this group, but one work that they came up with just this year, actually, it was launched in March, is the AUKU Reform Blueprint. And what's amazing about this document is that it attempts to actually analyze the act and look at, okay, these are the specific parts that needs reform. And it doesn't just look at, okay, we need to empower students. Okay, we know that. But they actually look at, the governance of universities itself, and they kind of make suggestions on this is how the decision-making channel should happen. This is the role of specific officers in the governance of universities. And they also, they also propose reforms in the decision-making process at the ministry level, because their hypothesis is that, okay, the way the ministry is set up right now is that it makes it easy for political interests to shape how students are governed. So this should be the channel of decision-making to protect the integrity of student governance, okay? To kind of depoliticize that decision-making path. So I'm just going to exit this for a while to share, some of the work, and I'll be showing other groups as well that, I thought were quite good. Okay, right. So for Heya, you can actually go to your Instagram page and look at some of the infographics that they came up with. Like I mentioned just now, they talk about restructuring the governance structure in institutions. So this is one infographic that explains it, and they have a kind of elaboration here. And I talked also about the decision-making process at the ministry level. So this infographic talks about that. Okay, and there's an elaboration in the caption as well. Okay, another group I wanted to highlight is Why Politics. So it's not strictly student-led, but they definitely have like students amongst their staff. And what really interests me in their work is how quickly they churn out infographics on current issues. And their infographics are very, very simple. I mean, this is probably from flat icons, and I probably just need a PowerPoint to put this together, but it's accessible, it's based on research, it works, people seem to like their work, and they churn it out very quickly. So they have that stamina to kind of churn out content consistently and keep people updated on the current issues. Another, oops. I just need to write. Another group I wanted to highlight is, it's quite new. It's called Malaysian Youth for Education Reform. And they actually take a more education system centric perspective. So they cover quite a number of issues. So for example, they look at the blueprint. They do have a component on student activism, but I'm not sure yet what they're doing here, because it's still coming soon. Right. Still work in progress. And they also have sex education, if I'm not yep, the importance of sex education. Okay, and they also have a project on the legal rights of students. So I think this is quite a novel angle where it actually tells students that if your teachers, you know, violate you in some way, and I'm not just talking about like physical or sexual abuse, but you know, in terms of any forms of abuse, these are the legal actions that you can take. Right now on their website, it's work in progress, but I believe if you go to their Instagram page, they actually have some infographics and some detail on what they want to achieve with this project. Okay, so I think that's all we wanted to share. Just to wrap up my presentation. Mm, right. So I mentioned in the abstract that, you know, I'll be kind of sharing some reflections on the challenges of doing public education work like this. And of course, the challenge is always accessibility, you know, because ultimately, you know, the work is in English. So there's always this question of who are we speaking to? You know, who would this reach? And of course, secondly, how accessible actually is the content. I mean, it looks bright and sunny, we have infographics, but is it reaching people that it can help? You know, so that's a challenge and a question that we will have to keep on revisiting. And and thirdly, I think is, so I mentioned accessibility, I mentioned, okay, audience, etc. So the third thing, I guess, is resources, because ultimately, you know, the easy part is doing that that research work, you know, to have your focus group discussions and to have a social media campaign. It was challenging. The project was challenging because the timeline was extremely tight, but the really impactful part, which is when we wanted to meet ministries, you know, that really, I think, kind of kind of make the project a little bit incomplete in terms of what we wanted to achieve. You know, it would have been good for us to actually bring this content to the ministry or to whichever relevant party, and you know, advocate for you know, for action to be taken, or you know, to agree on the next steps together, etc. And you know, that just kind of ties in back to the challenge I mentioned earlier. Ultimately, you know, you can have this work at the working level, you can convince people, you can generate support, but the moment you get to the policy making side of things, you know, it kind of stops there. It is really, really dependent on how much they want to pursue the topic, and whether you've built a relationship with the right individuals who can, you know, slip you in, or you know, arrange a meeting and put you in touch with certain people. Okay. So I would say those are my final reflections. Okay. And I guess just to answer Azura's question, I noted it down just now. I think you asked me about, you know, has the student activist voice disappeared, or is it like surprising that, you know, recently they've been more vocal? I would say that the student voice really gained, kind of revived in the 90s, you know, with Reformasi. Like I mentioned just now, you know, there were all these obstacles put in place, you know, that made it very difficult for students to carry out any forms of activism, you know, because their future depended on them being compliant. But Reformasi came along and kind of gave a lot of people a greater good, you know, I would say, you know, that there's something worth risking their lives for, their futures for. And that momentum kind of built up, you know, so we see Verse happening, and we see a lot more student demonstrations. And you know, the next game changer came in with the internet, digital advocacy, and Undi 18. So I would say that the buildup has been, you know, quite steady actually. And what Undi 18 does is kind of give a model, you know, of doing project management and advocacy at the same time, you know, which makes it more organized. So I would say that it isn't surprising if we look at the trends. Okay, so I'll stop there. Over to you, Kakin. And thank you, everyone.
Right. Thank you, Qaleeda. I think we shouldn't waste because I think Qaleeda has to leave by 10, right? Maybe we can straight away for Kok Hing's comments first.
Okay, saya teruskan dulu ah. Okay, so I think I'll start. I'll use both Malay and English lah. So pertamanya saya mengucapkan tahniah dan syabas kepada Imagine Malaysia, because you guys did a great studies within the time frame and the resources that you guys have, right? Within I think the entire 3-4 months from conception to finalizing the report. So tahniah, it's not an easy thing to do. I think for this report, it will be very beneficial for you guys to compile it into one document and release it in the forms of, let's say, ebook ke apa kan. So make it easy for people to share and to find, to cite lah. I think the transcripts especially will be very beneficial for people. And of course, if you have the resources, maybe can consider to menterjemahkan dalam bahasa Melayu lah. Okay, so I will begin my comment by saying that this year is actually the ulang tahun aku yang ke-50, right? Aku was first digubah 1970 and then of course dipindah beberapa kali, I think 7 kali. It was made much stricter a few years after it was first introduced. But when it was introduced, it's 1971. So, tahun ni memang tahun yang penting lah untuk ulang tahun aku dan untuk kita meninjau perkembangan gerakan mahasiswa. And another context for the development of student activism is a few weeks or months ago, Menteri Pengajian Tinggi, she announced that the ministry is likely to retain AUKU, which is a departure from the previous ministry's decision in which they tengah mengkaji nak remove AUKU and come up with a new law to replace AUKU. So there's that's that development that is going on lah in a broader context. Okay, so saya telah membaca sedikit laporan yang telah dibuat oleh Imagine Malaysia dan juga mengikuti pembentangan saudari Qaleeda tadi. So I have 4 points to make lah, and I look forward to the discussion with our audience later. I see some very prominent names, and so I'm sure they have a lot of inputs to give. Okay, so I have 4 points to be made quickly. Yang pertama, what's the phase of categorization or division ataupun perubahan susunan taktik dalam gerakan mahasiswa contemporary? We know that in the past there are few phases, beberapa fasa di gerakan mahasiswa. In Meredith Wise punya buku, dia pernah cakap, there's that more leftist phase, there's that more Islamist phase, nationalist dan sebagainya lah. Pada masa ni bagaimana? I think that's an interesting topic that can be explored, and perhaps untuk student master atau PhD untuk mengkaji secara lebih mendalam. We know that the political realignment even from before the previous election, terutamanya the split perpecahan dalaman PAS kemudian amanah telah memberi kesan kepada gerakan mahasiswa, di mana kita nampak banyak gerakan mahasiswa telah split dan fragmented, dan they form their own new group, even in UKM, and this is only among the more prominent sides of student activism. Kalau yang lain-lain tu lagilah mereka splinter group dan sebagainya. Dan bagaimana pula dengan trend selepas penjajaran politik semua tu kan? Bagaimana dengan apakah trend baru dalam gerakan mahasiswa? I think there are probably those who are in the scene now, seperti I nampak Umar ada di sini. He's a current student activist, so I think that he would have more more updates on this lah. But from my perspective, I just mentioned 3 quick trends that I see ongoing. Number one, maybe there's gerakan mahasiswa mungkin seolah-olah lebih formalized sekarang. Dan ini melalui sedikit latar belakang, saya pernah membuat kajian tentang student aktivis juga dalam master thesis saya mengenai gerakan mahasiswa menentang ataupun menuntut pendidikan percuma, perjuangan against PTPTN and so on. So one of the student activists that I interviewed, he said that one difference between student activism now in 2021 compared dengan zaman dia, which is around 2010, 2012, is that group yang informal semakin kurang pengaruh. And what he mean by that, last time he was with Solidarity Mahasiswa Malaysia. So this group is dia ada luar kampus lebih aktif lah. Di kampus dia ada nama lain kan, sebab dia gerakan yang bukanlah bawah tanah tapi ada gerakan informal. Maksudnya dia tak diregister dalam universiti. Tapi dengan adanya pembukaan ruang dalam terutamanya after pindahan AUKU dan kemudian kerajaan baru dan sebagainya kan. So these informal groups are becoming less influential. So there's that penumpuan perhatian gerakan mahasiswa telah lebih formalized kepada grup-grup seperti student union yang baru dibuat I rasa 2 tahun perhaps. And some of the student unions are not even really instituted yet, not fully instituted. But you can see the shift in focus from informal groups to more formal channels of participation. Nombor 2, kenapa increasing presence of party politics? Maksudnya, selepas bina AUKU yang membolehkan parti mahasiswa berpolitik dalam dan juga luar kampus, kita mendapati bahawa parti politik telah membina branch-branch lah mahasiswa. Contohnya keadilan, penasihatkan mahasiswa keadilan. Sekarang ada mahasiswa roket. Ini tidak termasuk UMNO Bersatu dan sebagainya. So kita nampak parti politik semakin aktif secara eksplisit, dulu implisit, sekarang secara terbuka kan, untuk mempengaruhi ataupun menyusung gerakan di dalam kampus. And this has some effects lah on gerakan mahasiswa as a whole. Adakah sekarang ini aktivis mahasiswa is a autonomous agent, an autonomous group, ataupun dia hanya satu wing daripada a broader organisation which is political party. Yang ketiga adalah there's a new ways of mobilizing. I can see perhaps this is a new trend. I think Qaleeda mentioned Undi 18, Y Politics, MYER, group-group seperti itu. Kita tidak nampak grup-grup ini macam berakar di sesuatu lokasi. Contohnya dululah UKM ada Diskopi. We know that okay, Diskopi group memang dia always at UKM, dia berdiskusi di sana. Ataupun kalau even go further back, there are groups in UM dan ITM. Tapi sekarang ini it's hard to pinpoint their physical base. You know, where's the physical base for Undi 18 for example. So there's innovation of tactics dan juga mobilization dan juga macam mana mereka advocate. Cara-cara itu semakin berubah dengan perubahan zaman. Okay. I'll try to go a bit faster. Poin yang kedua yang saya nak bawa adalah mahasiswa they have to face this choice of which issues they want to emphasize. Dalam research saya pasal gerakan mahasiswa menentang PTPTN ataupun hutang pinjaman pendidikan tinggi, there's this debate, internal debate within them, di mana mereka nak fokus pada isu isu tradisional mahasiswa seperti AUKU. That was one of the big thing lah, right? That has always been one of the big things. Compare that dengan isu yang mereka nak shift kepada more bread and butter issues. Maksudnya isu-isu yang cari makan lah, isu-isu berkaitan dengan kos sara hidup, isu-isu berkaitan dengan mahasiswa tak ada kerja, pinjam duit banyak, keluar kerja Grab contohnya. Bagaimana mahasiswa memposisikan diri antara dua isu ini dan bolehkah mereka menarik lebih ramai mahasiswa untuk aktif dalam perjuangan dengan focusing on which issue should they emphasize and mobilize. Itu satu keputusan yang ataupun dilema yang seringkali lah kumpulan mahasiswa has to decide. Okay, ketiga yang saya rasa poin ketiga yang saya rasa kurang dibincangkan dalam academic literature dan sebagainya adalah the neoliberal consequence and the impact on student activism. Saya teringat seorang bekas menteri pernah cakap, kenapa student activism tidak begitu aktif? Walaupun pada ketika saya jadi menteri, saya telah meletakkan moratorium terhadap AUKU. Maksudnya, I won't punish you if you are active voicing out your opinions, but he is still disappointed why nobody kind of make use of that space, contohnya. Itu apa yang dia cakap lah waktu di interview. Tapi saya rasa that view, I appreciate that view, but I think he is missing one point, which is that isu mahasiswa semakin senyap dan sebagainya disappear bukan sahaja kerana kengkangan AUKU, which is important. I think we shouldn't deny the AUKU punya repression effect. Walau bagaimanapun, AUKU is not the only thing that stops student activism. Sekarang ini compare dengan zaman maybe 3-40 tahun dulu, mahasiswa sekarang kebanyakannya meminjam hutang pinjaman pendidikan. Mengikut data, we have about 50%, about 50% of graduates borrow PTPTN money. Maksudnya, sebelum mereka bekerja ataupun sebaik saja dia melangkah keluar dari universiti, dia telah mempunyai 5-figure debt. Hutang average about 20,000 ringgit hutang. So it's more risky for them to be involved in student activities. There are more things at stake, so that's the implication when education or higher education is being commoditized, right? Higher education is not a commodity, it's about money. Kita semua fokus sekarang, okay, ambil duit, pinjam duit, masuk uni, lepas tu keluar kerja, dapat kerja. If tak dapat kerja, kena buang ataupun blacklisted, susah. And one of the student activists, when interviewed, he also said something like that. He said that because he did not join, he was expelled ataupun suspended sebab dia main activism kan. So bila dia keluar nak pergi kerja, susah. Public sector dah tak payah cakap lah sebab dia dilihat sebagai pembangkang kan, pro pembangkang. Private sector banyak company yang enggan ataupun disinclined to hire him because dia kata dia tak nak troublemaker. Company semua tak nak troublemaker. So, itu kesan terhadap student activist tu agak teruk jugalah. Okey, dan keempat, mungkin saya rasa kita boleh bincang di mana letak duduknya gerakan mahasiswa di Malaysia berbanding dengan compatriots di negara lain seperti kita nampak hangat sekarang di Thailand, Myanmar, Indonesia. So there's always that comparison why our student activists are less volatile ataupun less taking the lead on certain issues, right? So I think this one perhaps we can someone should do a comparative study lah on why so student activism berbeza patternnya dengan negara lain. Ada sedikit kajian dibuat tetapi tidak cukup menyeluruh lah pada pandangan saya. Okay, dan let me end my comment by by wrapping up some of the current research that has been ongoing, but I think Qaleeda already mentioned actually some of the things that I think are worth mentioning. The Hak Siswa, Why Politics, Bicara Malaya, which is a new one. They are trying to start the journalism in campus. So I think they are reviving, the golden days lah, so to speak, of gerakan mahasiswa. Dan saya rasa mungkin juga kita perlu pay attention to some gerakan mahasiswa informal yang tidak mempunyai their attention is not at the national level. Kumpulan-kumpulan seperti contohnya lah Borneo Comrade. Kalau Zikri Rahman ni, kalau dia ada di sini mungkin dia boleh add on a bit lah. So Zikri did doing a study on groups like Borneo Comrade. So these are maybe gerakan mahasiswa yang quite fed up with the current politics and they seek to make change. Not by directly infiltrating the political system or even to change the government, but trying to build sekolah alternatif contohnya di Sabah untuk let's say kanak-kanak yang stateless. So itu juga satu form of gerakan mahasiswa yang mungkin kita kurang memberi perhatian kerana we don't see the politic of it kan. Padahal yang memang politik pun. So saya rasa ini benda-benda yang maybe we have been too national focused and we kind of ignore a bit of the side things. I mean the side things are interesting as well. So itu saja komen-komen saya. I look forward to our discussion nantilah. Our audience gempak, so look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kok Heng. I think ada satu soalan juga dekat chat group. I think Qaleeda nak reply the comments first or do we open questions and I read questions in the chat box?
Actually, I just wanted to reply to Kok Heng because he raised some really good points as well. I think the biggest one is this conundrum that students still face about the consequences of activism. And I like that you brought up that comment made by I can't remember his name, I'm sorry, but he noted that okay, there was a moratorium, so why were people still why were students not taking advantage of that time and that space? And I think, there are a few things we can talk about, which is firstly the inertia of, having all these shackles in place, and kind of, the creation of this mindset that activism doesn't pay. Like, if you do it, you're disruptive. And, Kokin, you mentioned that, even today that stigma persists where, if you're kind of vocal or you have a certain reputation online, or, if you were expelled or suspended or whatever, employers are like, "Ugh." So, there's been this systematic creation of disempowering people, and we can talk about how it doesn't just affect students, it affects the population at large. So I would say that, yeah, that still remains a challenge, to kind of overcome that stigma and that inherited um, hesitance, and you could say that it's not just created by uh, things like the decisions of employers. It's also created by the kind of economy that we live in right now, where there's just too much at stake that it makes you kind of stop and think. And that's where that debate about the professionalization of activism comes in, where you know people want to be paid to be doing activist work. And does it make that more bureaucratic? Does that actually move us away from the goals of activism, even if it incentivizes us to join that space? So yeah, there's a lot of really kind of tangled dynamics at play. So okay, before that, Courtney, would you want to say anything? Maybe I can move on to the question.
Yeah, please do move on to the question. It's okay. I think that
Okay, cool. All right. So for the benefit of everyone here, I'll just read out the question. Do you think there is an ethical dilemma if students' activist group were to be funded by foreign powers, even though the students' group has good intention towards their advocacy? My straight answer is yes, because foreign powers are obviously not neutral. And if we're talking about foreign powers in Malaysia, one of the more prominent funders is the US. Even this project was funded by US aid, by Mari. If my Mari funders are here, hello. And you know, if we were to say like, okay, this project is funded by the government in Myanmar, the kind of moral dilemma doesn't exist. I mean, we immediately see that, okay, it's wrong. But for a group that is as a nation that is kind of um, that has a better reputation like the United States, that's where the dilemma comes in. But I would still say that, there is definitely an ethical dilemma, because, the US has committed war crimes. And often when they fund this kind of activities, it's not necessarily for the good of the people, the local people. There is always a kind of agenda, whether it's to, provide platforms for more disruptive elements, etc. But that being said, I don't think, this is the right question to ask, because ultimately, we have to respect that there are some people who just need that funding, and they're doing it for their cause. I mean, it's just kind of like asking people, oh, you're joining a GLC, so are you, you're being funded by them, your benefits are being given by them, so does that make you complicit in the system? I think that unnecessarily punishes people for choices that they can't really make. It's a difficult choice to say no to, right? So perhaps the conversation we should be having is, what other alternatives can we give student groups, so that we can kind of, create a more, a less ethically charged decision in terms of how they mobilize themselves or operationalize themselves. Kokin?
Oh, sorry. About funding, I think there's one point to be made, which I think actually Umar is the one who pointed out on Twitter. So he's from pertama Kesatuan Mahasiswa UM kalau tak silap So he said that actually under the current AUKU, walaupun telah membenarkan mahasiswa berpolitik dalam dan luar kampus, there's still some problematic clauses in AUKU, so I would disagree with one of the people in the report yang telah di-interview, di mana he said AUKU doesn't have an effect. Okay, one of them is basically the autonomy to raise funding. So mahasiswa, persatuan mahasiswa now cannot raise money themselves. They cannot collect the funds from mahasiswa under certain regulations. So it's not easy. So that makes it difficult because without financial independence, macam mana dia nak bergerak? So kalau macam soalan tadi, dilema kerana funded by foreign powers. Okay, fine. You don't want us to use foreign funding. Then what? You don't allow us to raise money from the students, by the people, right? Funded by the people. And then the other option, which has been traditionally the case, is dapat money dari parti politik. Di mana when their goals align, they get some money from political parties to bergerak dan berceramah di a few places. Okay, the drawback of that is that when you are financially dependent on parties, then mereka akan mempunyai pengaruh dah dalam keputusan you. Contohnya, one of the student group mentioned that because dia terhutang budi sebuah parti politik yang memberi duit untuk dia bergerak, he was asked to go to an event. And then dekat event tu, dia diberi baju untuk dipakai, di baju parti. So he feel conflicted. I'm a student activist, I'm supposed to be independent, autonomy, but then because I'm financially dependent on this guy, I have to do something in return for the favor. So that's one point of financial autonomy of the students.
I think we received a few questions in the chat box. I'll read the first question. I think it's from Hikmat Soy. Dear Qaleeda, I'm quite thankful for your sharings first. Then I would like to ask how you did choose your participants for your research. I mean, there are many types of activism, including party politics, campus politics, etc. So do you choose your participants by focusing one of them?
Okay, sorry, I paused, to think about how to answer this question, because so how our focus group discussions worked is that there were themes to the groups that we picked out. So of course there were groups that had more or less aligned goals. We tended to go by that strategy, to kind of group them based on aligned goals. So for example, we had groups with with student unions, with campus groups, and with groups that were more aligned to the previous, to Barisan Nasional or the current government, and we kind of grouped them together. The reason we did that is because we didn't want these discussions to devolve into fights. Not yet anyway. That would be kind of in the later stages, like if we had to bring them together to kind of thrash out certain things. But at the initial phase, we wanted them to kind of talk openly about their common goals. So we looked at those groups, and then we have groups that looked at party politics. Well, not party politics, but more about like campus politics, and there would sometimes be party politics kind of seeping into the issues. But we didn't just try to look at campus politics. We wanted to speak to groups that had other interests as well. We also spoke to some university administrators, actually. These are anonymous people, because a lot is at stake, but they kind of provided us input from the administrative perspective. So I guess in a nutshell, we kind of identified, okay, these are the groups that we have access to, and then we kind of group them together. But I still want to stress that, the plan was always to kind of have continued discussions with them, and, to diversify our pool of participants, even beyond the specified time frame of the project. So, we don't see this as like, okay, that's it. There would be, we could consistently reach out to like other groups, that come into our radar and think, oh, I think, it might be interesting for us to speak to them. It seems like we're talking about similar things.
Yeah, I think I just gonna have a bit of sharing on the question itself, because I myself is part of your research team. GPA was one of the research team. Yeah. I don't know, bila Kok Hin memberi komentar tentang di mana kedudukan mahasiswa kini dan mahasiswa di Malaysia dan di luar, dan juga apabila Qaleeda membentangkan tentang ada begitu banyak kumpulan mahasiswa tapi challenges faced by them is when mereka tak boleh nak bersama. Dan saya sendiri berada dalam salah satu gerakan mahasiswa yang saya tidak boleh bersama dengan kumpulan-kumpulan lain dan kita memilih untuk tidak bersama dengan mereka. Mungkin secara strategi mungkin bermasalah, kita tidak boleh bergerak jauh dan sebagainya, tapi saya fikir susah untuk gerakan seperti saya yang untuk bergerak dengan gerakan yang mungkin terlalu parti politikal punya ideologi, ataupun ada setengah tu macam tidak memahami tentang intersectionality, mungkin membantu isu-isu stateless tapi tidak bersetuju dengan isu lain. Saya fikir itu pun ada banyak masalah kenapa kita tak boleh nak bersama, ya. Dan lagi satu tentang komentar Kok Hin tentang isu mana yang kita nak pilih, ya. Saya fikir ada satu masalah juga dalam gerakan mahasiswa sekarang, mereka bergerak terlalu banyak ke arah lobby, terlalu banyak untuk meeting dengan kementerian, advokasinya adalah ke arah menjumpa YB dan sebagainya. Saya fikir itu pun antara punca kenapa kita tak boleh nak jawab di mana mahasiswa kat Malaysia sekarang dengan di luar. Ya. Okey. Saya rasanya saya kena baca soalan lagi satu kat sini. Soalan oleh Amira. In the 60s and 70s, the Malaysian economy was not as good it is today. Yet students in public universities, namely members of the student unions, went out of their way around the country to speak about national policies and also protest evictions, land grabs. For the working class, the 70s and the 2020s are both equally cruel. Is the economy or lack thereof truly a hindrance toward activism and the struggle for justice?
Yeah. Okay, I'll take it first, and then Kok Hin can give his comments. Right. So I think we shouldn't be kind of putting more weightage on one one factor over the other. I mean, economic considerations definitely come into play, but it's also about the outlook of the pool of students at that time. So that's why we talked about the kind of inertia created by the shackles placed by AUKU, by requirements made by scholarship bodies or employers. One thing we should be asking is what were some of the challenges faced by students today that the students of the 60s and 70s didn't have, and might that have changed the way they viewed the consequences of activism? I mean, if you spoke to the students of the 60s and 70s, they well, maybe 60s, they didn't have to contend with the consequences of AUKU yet. It hasn't entered their imagination about the way they mobilize themselves. And arguably, perhaps up until the mid 70s, the consequences are not yet fully felt. But certainly in this time and day, where there's more economic burden and there's more economic commitments, and it doesn't just affect your your ability to like fit yourself. It actually affects your trajectory for decades to come afterwards. What happens to you now, it's a different consideration altogether, I think. So I guess in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that we shouldn't just look at that one factor and think of it as that is the defining factor. We should kind of weigh the other factors in play and then see how this affects their outlook and imagination about activism and the cost to them at that time.
Okay. I think ada satu soalan I tertinggal tadi. It's from Mary. I wonder how the current student activists in Malaysia regard the political party. Maybe Qaleeda boleh.
I'm not really sure how to answer that question, because do you mean like the ruling party of the moment, or like political party based activism?
I think you can answer in like any
Okay.
both situations maybe.
Okay, right. I suppose it depends on who you ask, really, which group you're asking. There are some who would unhesitatingly say, the current government sucks and they need to go. And you would probably encounter student and youth groups who take a more reconciliatory role where, oh, it's not really this that party, it's just the current crop of administrators. If we had like different politicians fronting this party, we would be, the country would be dealt with differently or governed differently. So it really depends on who you're asking.
But I think surely majlis perwakilan pelajar kebangsaan bersetuju dengan government sekarang ya. I think they bring out a poster saying like terima kasih Abah. Okay, I think there's another question. Do you have any advice or tips for activist pages, organizations on how to get funding?
Hmm. To be honest, I don't know really. That's my honest answer. I don't really know, like, who are the channels of funding. Perhaps this is something Kokin would be more familiar with.
Not really, but Dewi Rizwan, like activist pages organisation get funding ni untuk macam mana? Persatuan mahasiswa dalam kampus atau luar kampus atau just NGO ke macam mana? Because these are different, right? So maybe you can clarify in the comment, then we can get back to it lah. Student and non-student, not NGO. Kalau student, student gerakan mahasiswa, I think need to check with the AUKU punya regulations. But if you are UIA, you are not under AUKU, so check your UIA punya ni. Or if you are IPTS, then IPTS lah, of course, right? So there are different ways to get around it lah. But some more legal than others. But if you want to get funding, like proper funding, like a grant punya, you kena berdaftar. Then baru mereka boleh bagi funding. Dan contohnya, imagine Malaysia got project funding for this project, right? It's a project basis funding. So kalau korang propose project, then maybe you guys can get funding. But you guys need to be berdaftar. Kalau tak berdaftar, dia tak boleh bagi. So itu secara more formal one. That's the more normal way of to get funding lah. You need to propose a project and you need to be registered. Of course, there are ways such as you can crowd fund, right? I think Syed Saddiq easily raised 6-figure, 100K, for laptop and so on. Crowd fund. If you are creative and so on, you can do it. Another way is to join some ongoing programs like fellow parliament yang dibuat oleh geng undi 18 lah. So what they do is you can propose a project and then you join them and they give you some allowance for project. So itu boleh membolehkan you untuk bergerak, dapat funding dan sebagainya. Different ways to get around it lah.
Okay.
But yeah, I think
I was about to say that Yeri has given us a clarification. So I'll just read it out. I mean, political party as a mean to express political will, because in Indonesia there's a kind of antipathy to political parties, and this makes student movements kind of stagnant because they remain as social movements and not political movements. All right. So my take is that I think in Malaysia, once you're part of a student group, a student activist group or student-led group, there is a kind of implicit political position, because if you're, kind of presenting, alternative modes of education or advocating for certain policy reforms, these are definitely in conversation with how things are being done in the country at the moment. So I would say that, there is that kind of implicit conversation if it's not explicit. But I think in Malaysia, the more interesting question is, does the passion, the drive, the motivation of student activist groups actually, reflect the moods of, students themselves? And I think that's where it gets, quite divided. There are students who would be happy to, throw their weight behind the work of activist groups. But, we go back to that issue of a kind of cultural inertia, this creation of the mindset that, activism is disruptive, it's disrespectful, it's not our culture. And I'm sure, there are many students who subscribe to those views and think that, no, we should be studying, this isn't our role or our area, etc. So I think in Malaysia, that's where, the kind of tension exists, and, the kind of, whether, there's antipathy to political movements or political dynamics exists.
Yeah, I think just to comment a bit on that, I think because the Indonesian students, I don't know, in my observations, because we actually quite close to Indonesian groups, and I think they are very clear in a bit of like, there's ada kelebihan untuk jadi political party dan ada juga kelebihan untuk jadi social movements. And Indonesia is very clear why we do this. Like, doesn't have you don't have to be in a political party to actually prove your political will or things like that. Sebab I think most of them realize that even if you have power, even if you are in the political party, banyak isu-isu, kemungkinan perubahan masih tak boleh berlaku, dan kebanyakan mereka pun percaya yang kerja-kerja bawah, grassroots, perbincangan tu benda-benda yang paling penting dan harus bergerak. Dan kemungkinan itu kenapa mereka memilih social movement. Dan juga kalau melihat kepada sejarah mahasiswa di Indonesia, bagaimana aktivis-aktivis mahasiswa yang diculik dan dibuang ke dalam laut dan sebagainya. Saya rasa ada banyak sangat baggage dekat Indonesia punya sejarah mahasiswa, dan saya rasa kita tidak boleh meletakkannya sebagai stagnant di situ. Yeah. The word stagnant, I don't think is like yeah.
Okay, sorry for the mistranslation, I suppose. Okay, so shall we move on?
I think
maybe we should mention to the audience that Qaleeda has to leave in a bit, right? So audience yang nak tanya soalan about the research done by Imagine Malaysia and so on, maybe you can ask Qaleeda some questions if you like while she's here and so on.
Saya rasa soalan Ahmad ni kita boleh teruskan sebelum. Ya. Satu bentuk aksi yang boleh dianggap satu tradisi dalam gerakan mahasiswa sejak zaman 60-an hingga 2010-an ialah demonstrasi turun ke jalan. Adakah tradisi ini sudah hilang di kalangan mahasiswa generasi 2020-an sekarang? Apakah faktor yang menyebabkan hal ini berlaku? Ya.
I think there's definitely a kind of reduction in, the size of student demonstrations that happens today. But I don't want to say that, the tradition is lost, rather that, it has evolved, because often when we see huge demonstrations in Malaysia, like Bersih, or, something like IWD, if you want to consider that big, it's really about groups, different groups coming together, to agitate for these common goals. So I wouldn't say that, the tradition is lost. I mean, I would say that it's evolved, really, taking into account, the kind of challenges and obstacles that students have faced. In fact, I think, we also have to take into account that, the modes of mobilization have changed as well. I mean, we talk about, digital advocacy. So right now, one way to mobilize support is to generate, a hashtag, and then, generate engagement numbers. So that is a new form of mobilization. And of course, the pandemic, that just changes the way we move and the way we behave with each other, right? So yeah, I think that's what I would, in a nutshell, I would put it that way, that it hasn't really lost. It's not lost. It's just that, they had like that kind of block, that lack of incentive to mobilize, but once there's more momentum, it's more about groups coming together for a common goal. And we also need to rethink the way we define demonstrations, because yes, you have very traditional modes where you take to the streets, and of course recently there were protests in front of parliament, but taking into account how digitalization has changed our behavior, that's where we need to rethink what demonstration entails. Okay.
Mungkin kita boleh ada satu soalan terakhir daripada participants atau apa-apa komen. Kalau tak ada, mungkin Qaleeda dan Kok Hin boleh bagi satu like conclusion of the discussion, or maybe how do we move forward after this discussion. Mungkin tadi pun Qaleeda cakap Imagine Malaysia is looking forward for collaborations. So how do we do that after this? Yeah.
Well, I think one idea that Imagine Malaysia is kind of playing around with, and we don't know what whether we're actually going to experiment, is can we perhaps kind of build a coalition of groups, a kind of secretariat to have action items in place. I mean, of course, there are lots of questions and doubts and, certainly misgivings about that course of action. I mean, I mentioned just now during my talk that, there's a line to be drawn when we talk about collaborations. Do we work based on common goals? Do we, say no to talking to certain groups and all that? But, that's something that we want to test out. But that being said, whether that actually happens, we are actively seeking to speak to people, to just kind of get their reactions to our work, because like even in this talk, hearing like Kok Hin's comments, and he has done more niche research than I have on this, and just engaging with the questions from the audience, it's interesting to see how these different thoughts and ideas trigger different directions in our thinking about the landscape, and what is an appropriate way to move forward. Thank you.
Kok Hin, ada any last words or conclusions, tips?
Tak ada tips sebab saya pun bukanlah pakar sangat pun. Saya hanya seorang penyelidik. Cumanya I would say that mahasiswa kena aktif menulis, kena rajin menulis. I think we do lack writings from mahasiswa. Apakah tawaran mahasiswa bagaimana menyelesaikan isu masyarakat contohnya. Gagasan mahasiswa itu kurang. So those who terlibat dalam gerakan mahasiswa, I think it will be great for them to write more so that we can hear their perspective and also how to improve the activism and so on. Yang keduanya, I think based on the series of questions that we have saw in the chat box dan sebagainya, I think we do have to be a little bit more appreciative of student activism. There's a great risk to student activism and very pulangan terhadap aktivism anda tu tidak banyak ataupun tidak secure sebenarnya. There are more costs than benefits to student activism on an individual level. And they endure great risk when they go to protest. Contohnya yang Qaleeda sebut, protes di parlimen hari itu mahasiswa juga, banyak orang muda yang sertainya. Geng undi 18, geng mahasiswa, geng muda, geng PSM, orang-orang muda banyak sertai. So we do have to cut them some slack lah, so to speak. And remember that 2020s, we only enter 1 year into the 2020s. So give them a little bit more time. And also, now we are having darurat. So the implications of your demonstrasi turun ke jalanan, sebelum turun pun sebenarnya, bila you dah start ajak, sebenarnya you exposing yourself to great risk. Di bawah darurat, Prime Minister can just issue any emergency ordinance EO untuk just increase. Contohnya esok dia kata 50 tahun kalau awak kutuk penjara 50 tahun. He can do that, Of course you can challenge in court, but by the time you nak habiskan proses mahkamah tu, you dah macam kesannya agak teruk lah. So with this in mind, I think we encourage more student activists to write, and also to the more general audience, I would say that we should appreciate student activism more, and place their activism in the context that they face lah. Okay, itu saja.
Can I add on to that? Because I think that is a very important point to raise, to just be generous about the challenges we face. I mean, I don't want to say we, like I wouldn't consider myself a student activist, but what those on the front lines face. And, that it kind of brings me back to the point I made just now. It's not so much about, whether, they should have done this or they should do that. Why are they not doing this? Like, the people in the past, rather it's about what are their blocks and how do we, as those who are not on that front lines, how can we enable them, and how do we provide alternatives for them, if we say that, okay, the economy puts a lot of constraints on our, on what we're able to advocate for, we talk about the consequences. Okay, as the people around them, how can we then, allow them to bypass these obstacles, or at least reduce, the weight of the consequences. So like, for example, if you're in a hiring position, maybe you shouldn't see student activists as, a threat, those with a history of student activist work, you shouldn't see them as a threat, So those are the kind of daily actions that we can take, if the system is too big, to fight back. Yeah, we should think about our role in enabling this work as well.
Soalan terakhir from someone, maybe you can Anton.
Okay. Hello, I'm a descendant of Filipino migrants from Sabah back in the 1970s, and I just want to say I am very proud of the initiative set forth by student organizations in railing for the rights and need of the PTI pendatang tanpa izin community. However, I want to admit there has been very little participation from the PTI descendants in organizing or even joining student unions due to fear of political repressions. As a result, a lot of problems stemming from our community have remained unsolved. My question is, how do we encourage these people who are coming from disadvantaged groups to rally themselves and fight for their rights, especially as they lack resources to organize such unions?
So I think, that's a very important question. And thank you, Anton, for, bringing it up, because, obviously the pendatang tanpa izin also have a voice in our political landscape. However, to be honest, I'm hesitant to answer your question because I don't want to speak over, their experiences, and your experiences as well. I think as a local Malaysian, with the comfort of, not being at risk of being deported or, something like that, I would think my role would be to create that space for, any comrades or friends or colleagues, who have that status, to be able to, get their voice across without actually needing to risk their safety. So I think, I would like to focus more on what I can do as a Malaysian rather than, telling you what you can do. And as a Malaysian, I would think it's about creating that safe and secure space where, we can platform your issues or the challenges you face without, needing you to take the brunt, of your activism, your viewpoints. And I think, this is where there are groups like the Naganita who, look at refugee-related issues or pendatang tanpa izin issues, and they try to do, they would have more insight into the praxis of it. How do you create that safe space? So I'm sorry that I cannot give you like a comprehensive answer, but as a Malaysian, definitely I would want to create that, that outlet for you, without you needing to come out and like risk your safety.
Okay, I think kita dah sampai ke penghujungnya. Terima kasih kepada Kak Hin dan Qaleeda. Saya suka apabila Kak Hin dan Qaleeda dua-dua mengkonklusikan perbincangan tadi dengan give the students some space, especially dalam waktu pandemik dan darurat. Dan saya rasa setiap kali kita bicara tentang mahasiswa, kita juga harus bicara di manakah suara pesyarah di belakangnya. Pesyarah pensyarah yang lebih berkredibiliti, yang lebih ada kuasa untuk bercakap, have the knowledge and everything, where are they, right? Dan kerana itu saya akan kembalikan soalan ini kepada Dr. Rosasina yang juga seorang pensyarah dan juga kembali kepada untuk mengakhirkan perbincangan ini. Ya, sekian daripada moderator.
Terima kasih Azura dan Qaleeda dan juga Kok Hin untuk perbincangan tersebut. Saya rasa saya tak dapat menjawab soalan Azura di dalam ruangan ini, cuma nak kata memang saya kagum dengan apa yang aktivis-aktivis mahasiswa sedang, ya, seperti Kok Hin, saya juga ingin, I want to be, supportive and generous of the I think courage that's needed for student leaders to go forth. And I really like Cohen's point about there are many different forms of movements, and sometimes we tend to see only those movements that are visible in front of us, that might be standing, at press conferences and so forth. But there are also many that are doing very important work in other different spaces. So I think we also definitely need to acknowledge that. Thank you again for this conversation, because I felt that even though it's not an intergenerational panel, it felt like an intergenerational conversation, because we started the conversation with Qaleeda situating it within the history of student activism and also Kok Hing's sharing of it. So in a way, I think that's really important, and maybe I'd like to encourage more of these kinds of intergenerational or reflective kind of conversation, because it allows us to really think about things that are taken for granted. For example, what are the different strategies? Do these strategies work? What are different motivations? What are the forms of alliances? And we kind of sort of maybe learn also from looking at what has worked before, and what in different kinds of spaces that also we need to look at in the future as well. So I really like the conversation, and really appreciate the kind of sharing, and also the kind of work that each of you are involved in as well. So yes, also I acknowledge the rallying calls for, I think I see a few lecturers in there, to also play our part as well in championing academic freedom and students' rights on campus and so forth. All right, so with that, thank you again to the speakers. Thank you to Qaleeda, to Kok Hin, and to Azura for excellent moderating. Next month, we have in store for, a film by Rachel Liu, Chinese Go Home, which has been shown before at Gerak Budaya, but we're doing a rescreening and also a new conversation with Rachel Liu on 20th of May. So please stay tuned. You can follow us on Pusat Sejarah Rakyat Facebook, so that you'll get updates on that. So thank you again, and thank you to all the audience for sharing and asking questions in this forum. So have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.